Hello and welcome to another episode of the Sporting Fan Podcast. Today I'm going to talk about the potential expansion of Super Rugby. Now, this is always a contested issue simply because with Super Rugby, it obviously started with three nations. It's teams from three nations. It started with teams from Australia, teams from New Zealand, and teams from South Africa, and then slowly but surely it expanded. More teams were added, both in South Africa and in Australia. Then there were teams added from, then there was a team added from Japan and a team added from Argentina. Now, as we have moved on in current times, we have had the South African, Japanese and Argentinian teams leave, and then we've also had Moana Pacifica and the Fijian draw come in. But in recent times, we have seen a few things happen. First of all, like I said, the Argentinians and the Japanese teams kind of went by the wayside, and they're no longer, those teams have ceased to exist, and the South African teams, they now all compete in Europe. We've also seen, when they first had a reconfiguration with the reduced Australian teams, originally the Western Force were kicked out of the comp. Then when, COVID happened and all that, after that they came back in. We saw the Melbourne Rebels, fold. I work in the insolvency space. I have heard little bits and pieces of what actually happened, why they went bust, and all that. But like I said, it was only bits and pieces. I don't know how much of it is true, and it's also it wasn't really, only got a fraction of the information. So I'm not going to put it out there because, like I said, I don't know the whole story, and I don't want anyone really getting in trouble. But as we saw, they have gone. They are no longer in the competition in the Western Four. So there's currently 5 New Zealand teams, 4 Australian teams, and 1 Fijian team. So Moana Pacifica were in the competition this year, but the financial backers of that team have stopped backing them just simply because it wasn't financially viable. Now, that means the competition is going to be a 10-team comp next year. It was 11 this year. It was 12 when the Melbourne Rebels were in. And it was a bigger competition when the South African, Japanese, and Argentinian teams were in. Now, that poses the actual, what I was going to talk about in this podcast. That's just the background of Super Rugby. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Now, a lot of people say that, a lot of old-timers say that, fine how it is, don't expand, the competition's fine. My thinking is I don't agree with that, just mainly because of how the competition has gone the last few years. There isn't I don't think there's a problem with the quality of the product, especially when the New Zealand teams play against them. I know the Australian teams have struggled off late. But I think the biggest problem is there seems to be a lack of interest, especially on the Australian side of the Tasman. Crowds are way down. Viewership's not what it was, 20 years ago. So the question then becomes, how do you get it more popular? So there's two markets that when I was actually looking into this, doing this podcast, there were two markets that potentially that was the Super Rugby was potentially going to expand to, and for different reasoning. The first is bringing teams in from Japan. So the team that was in before was the Sunwolves. And apparently, from what I read, there was a lot of problems with the Sunwolves and how they operated. Firstly, they weren't really properly, from what I heard, I don't know if this is true, but from reporting, I remember seeing that they weren't really fully supported by, the new Japanese Rugby Federation. I'm not exactly sure what they're called, but apparently they weren't properly really supported. And the other problem is they're the only Japanese team, a little bit like the problem that the Jaguares had, which was the Argentinian side. There was a lot of travelling, so when you're travelling from Japan to South Africa this week, and then you might have a couple of games in South Africa, then you're going to New Zealand, then you might be going to Argentina or Australia. It's a lot of travel. They're a one team country, and so I think the combination of not being properly supported by the governing body, as well as being a one-team nation, the only team in their nation, I think if they're going into Japan, the discussions, what they're saying is that they're going to really look at more when they're looking at the expansion, the organisers of the rugby, Super Rugby, they're looking at potentially bringing in a number of, I'm not sure exactly how many, but 2, potentially 3 or 4 Japanese teams, looking at their competition, because they do have a competition in Japan, and looking at bringing in some of those teams into Super Rugby. I don't know how many they are going to be looking at, whether it be 2 or 3. They're bringing in potentially the whole comp. I don't think that will be feasible if they did bring in all 10 teams, but I don't know how it will work. They might do a similar kind of system as what the South Africans did, where they had kind of like what they had a Curry Cup competition, and the top kind of teams playing the Super Rugby the following season, and then that's how it worked. Maybe that's how they can do it, or potentially have it like a New Zealand competition, where they have, or even to a lesser extent, Australia, like like in New Zealand they have a regional teams, like in I think they call it the NPC, or used to be called the NPC. Basically what it is you play for a particular region, like Manukau. I think it was Manukau was a team. Tasman, I believe Otago is a team. Canterbury, Wellington, these kind of teams. And then and those they have their NPC, and then after the NPC they play. But then with the Super Rugby they play for whichever Super Rugby team. So Auckland, you got the Blues, the Chiefs, the Hurricanes, Crusaders, and the Highlanders. So they could implement that system where they have their own competition that stays in place, but potentially and then they have that kind of system, or it's like the Australian system where they have the grades. I don't think they'll have the grade system like Australia. I think that it might be something similar to either the South African system or the New Zealand system potentially. It'll be interesting to see how they do it. And that will be the Japanese. That's how they would have the Japanese come in potentially. And the reason why they want the Japanese in there is because the money. Now, obviously in Japan, the rugby has really grown, especially in the lead up to the World Cup in 2019 when it was hosted by the Japanese. It was they did very well in the 2019 World Cup. They did well in the 2015 World Cup as well, where they didn't make the finals, I should say, but they did have 3 wins in the pool stages. They're actually, unfortunately, the only team to have 3 wins in the pool stages and not make the quarterfinals. And in the other Rugby World Cup, so they really invested a lot of money to get a team competitive. And Japan's rugby is now quite. They went into a bit of a dip after that World Cup where they didn't really perform as well. But now they want to get back to. They want to get up and potentially have a strong system again, where they're again competitive against the top teams, and so that's why they want to potentially bring the Japanese. They have better competition, and I know a lot of people that support rugby go, oh, but they're already getting a lot of Australians, a lot of South Africans go over, a lot of Kiwis go over there as well. But it's usually towards the back end of their careers that they go over. Not always, but quite regularly. A lot of them, they make their names in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and they go over there when they're 30 plus. Whereas so the players still learn with them, but they usually past their prime. Whereas if you're playing against those players, are playing against them week in, week out, like they were in the Super Rugby, they become a stronger side, and I think that could be really beneficial for the Japanese if they're playing against the Australia and New Zealand each week. Especially against the Kiwis, they can potentially get players to a certain level where they might not beat New Zealand, but at least they might become more competitive. And it's a lot easier for them potentially to get, because than Europe, because I'm not sure the flight times to Europe from Japan, but it's about 7 or 8 hours from Sydney, the flight time. But also the big advantage that they have is the time zone. So if you look at the TV, because this is big money is in the TV, right? And as because a lot of money will come from Japanese TV, and time zone wise, it is better for the Japanese to play against Australia and New Zealand because in their time zone, I believe they're on the same time zone as potentially Perth, Western Australia. They're either Western Australia or so they're only 2 hours behind. That's where it will be really good in terms of TV coverage. So I think that's where they could get the Japanese. And I think that's where the main growth is, where you could get the money from Japan, but then they're also getting the competition. So I think it benefits both sides. You could potentially set up programs. This is where I think the finance side of it can come in. They could get more of a partnership where you do tours and stuff with the Super Rugby with supporters, and I think the finance. But then it also helps Japan because they're playing against better opponents. Now the second expansion is potentially into the United States. The United States expansion is going to be quite interesting because in the United States, they've got currently Major League Rugby. In my experience, I don't really know much about it. I believe that they have had a few financial problems with a few teams, and it's not big, really. I know I have heard that rugby is growing in the United States, but it's not overly popular. I think if they're playing against the top teams, because the big thing that they want is that I've seen that World Rugby has is that they're bringing a lot of international games to the United States, but then not often are they actually playing the United States teams. It's always, for example, there was Ireland and the most famous one is Ireland versus New Zealand when the Irish beat New Zealand for the first time about 10 years ago. But there's been other games since then, and I know the All Blacks did play against the US a few years ago now, but the US couldn't get a lot of their best players, so it ended up something like about 100-0 or something like that. And this is where I personally think that if they're similar to the Japanese, the arguments are going to be the same for the United States. So, leading up to the 2019 World Cup, they had the Sunwolves, and you see the Japanese teams become better and better, and then they ended up making the quarterfinals at the 2019 World Cup. The argument for the American and Canadian teams to come in, because there was also talk that they'll bring some Canadian teams in. What I heard was that they were going to bring in two teams in America, one team in Canada, is what I heard. I believe there was the two American teams were going to be, one was going to be based in, I think it was supposed to be one in Texas, one in California. I think the Texan team was supposed to be out of Houston, because there is a direct flight on United Airways from Houston to Australia, and I'm not sure if that was, if that's going to continue. I also have heard potentially San Francisco is either San Francisco or Los Angeles were going to be the Californian team. So I don't know how that's going along. I didn't hear where the Canadian team is. I did, but I just heard that there was 2 American, 1 Canadian. So there's been some pushback from the Australians saying they don't like ex-players saying, "Oh, we don't think it's going to be a good idea." I think that it would be, because if you look at how what happened with Japan in the lead up to the World Cup in 2019. They played I know they only had 1 team in the Super Rugby, and not all the players were picked from the Sunwolves. There were a lot from their own domestic competition. But if you look at their how they competed, they're competing against South African teams, who I know are no longer in the Super Rugby, but they're competing against South African, New Zealand and Australian teams. And it got them to a level where they were competitive. Now, the next, and at their home World Cup, they want to do something similar for the American teams, right? So I think, because this is where a lot of people think it's just financial, but it's not just financial. It's, you look at every major sporting event, right? They want the host nations to do well. Like, look, you take the Soccer World Cup, right? Do you think, like, the Americans, I know, are not the biggest soccer fans, and I'm changing sports here, but it probably wouldn't have had the success it had if the Americans didn't reach the round of 16. Now, because a lot of Americans were still invested up until that point. So as they were still invested to that point, it still got a lot of media coverage and all that. Now, admittedly, Americans are a lot better at soccer than they are at rugby. But this is what will be a big thing for World Rugby if they can get American money in. Because look at, for example, Major League Soccer. They've had a lot of big names go over there and play. They've had Beckham play for LA Galaxy. They've had currently Messi's over there and all that. So they've got quite a they're growing, and while it's getting to a point where, yes, it's not the European leagues, but at least they can be the local league is quite competitive. At the moment, Major League Rugby is not really competitive, but if they're playing against some top teams, where they're seeing on the weekly basis, they're seeing, guys like that play for the All Blacks, that play for the Wallabies, and they're playing against them on a weekly basis, they will naturally become better over time. And I think there's no point in them coming in 2030 or 2031, the year of the World Cup in the United States. You need to do it, in my personal opinion, I think they should do is bring them in, which is I think what the plan was, at least 2 teams in the US, 1 team in Canada in 2028. So you have 4 years where those teams are getting better. The reason why I say it won't work if you just bring them in the 2030 or 2031, they can't refine their skills enough in that shorter period. Whereas, first 2 years they probably won't be competitive. Because look at for example Fiji. They they weren't really competitive in first couple of years, but now that they've been in the competition for a few years now, they're becoming competitive, and that's in a small, admittedly, country where rugby is a big thing, but it's only a population of a little over 100, about 150, 180,000, something like that. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe 300,000. But it's only a small population, Fiji, and they're now competitive, and they're able to get these rugby players that are competitive, and they haven't even got it's not even the Fijian national team. Like, a lot of their players play in Europe and in Japan. And a lot of their players also get poached to play for other nations. So, just imagine if they did that in the United States with, you may get some big businessman that backs it. They need so that's the biggest thing. They need that. I think that's why they want to have it in Texas and in California, because it's, two of the bigger economic, I know there's also New York, but, Texas and California have very big, financial centers, have very big companies based there, and if they can get a few companies to really back them financially and get a couple of the colleges over there to really get it, to help bring in rugby, and it becomes bigger. I reckon if they bring it in 2028, by 2030, 2031, they have it. 2 years where they've struggled, but by the third and fourth year, if they get a little bit of financial backing, I think they can, I wouldn't say a force, but they could become competitive, and then that's when they have the national team as well, where the national team also becomes competitive, and you see that, and then it's all of a sudden, well, we could potentially have, Super Rugby, where, Super Rugby leads into the national team, and then and they can potentially have, in a few years, have 3 or 4 teams, in Super Rugby, and that are competitive, and all of a sudden, they're really strong, and, you can also make it where they joke against the other team, other sports, where, because that's the old running joke with the rest of the world, and even some of their own athletes have even joked about, like, oh, we're the world champions, we've got the World Series and all that, and they're playing, they only play against, other American teams. They can say, oh, we play against New Zealand teams, we play against Australian teams, we play against Fiji, and potentially Japan, if Japan comes in. Look, we play against multiple different nations. How can you call yourselves worlds? You get we get to travel a lot more, and we're actually playing a world sport. And so they can use that as a kind of a selling point and try to get more people playing, that you can play all around the world. And yeah, so I think it will be very beneficial for the for all involved, because I think it'll be beneficial for Japan and America, just because I think their players will get to play against top quality opponents, and their skills will inevitably improve, which means, it's only can be a good thing if teams are, there's more competitiveness in the world, because the worst thing, I think, it gets kind of boring if it's the same teams winning, and not only are they winning, they're annihilating teams. So if the teams are at least competitive, yes, I like to see Australia win. Yes, I like, my mum's a Kiwi. I like to see New Zealand win as well. But I don't want to see them winning every game 60, 70, 80 nil, and because at the Rugby World Cup it became, and I know this is about Super Rugby expansion, but the Super Rugby expansion leads into the international game as well. You see a lot of the pool matches at the Rugby World Cup, and it's really half the time it's not even worth watching until the finals, because you just know what the results are going to be. Like, there's one competitive match in the pool stages, which is usually one, and if you're lucky, two competitive games in a pool. The rest, you can go, New Zealand's going to beat Tonga by 50 points, and they're going to beat Namibia by 80 points, and it's just, what's the point? We know how this is going to go. They could play a bloody they could even play an NPC team against them, or in South Africa's case, they could play a bloody Curry Cup team against a lot of these nations. Like, no disrespect, but they could play literally not even a Super Rugby team. They could play literally a Curry Cup or a NPC team, and they would probably win, or at bare minimum they would be competitive. Whereas if they get rid of those dead games where those teams are all of a sudden competitive, where those top tier nations, they probably still win. Like, the Soccer World Cup, Brazil's going to beat Australia, for example. You just know that's going to happen. But instead, no one really wants to see if you have, however many pool games there are, however throughout the stage, if 80% of them end up in blowouts, well, what's the point in watching it? Whereas if you reduce that to 20% of games that are blowouts, where 80% are competitive, where it's within 15 or 20 points, then you're going to get a lot more viewership, and you're going to get a lot more people attending the games. You're going to get a lot more people watching the games, and then that hopefully leads into the domestic comps, where like Super Rugby, because you get to see these players a lot more often, and that leads to more exposure to the competitions. So that's where it can kind of lead into one another, where they see them at the international level, but you need to get those teams competitive at the international level. Then you can get more kids playing. Then when you get more kids playing, then all of a sudden that's when there's a flow-on effect. So hopefully, but it all starts, I think, if they get those teams into Super Rugby, I think it can get the ball rolling, and then it will eventually lead to the international game becoming more competitive, which then results in more kids playing, and then which will then result in a stronger competition. So it's kind of like a cycle. So I'll be interested to hear what everyone thinks. If you, I'd like to hear if you agree with me, don't agree with me, and until next time, have a good one.